Let your breath slow and your thoughts drift gently across time tonight. We journey far back to the sun-drenched landscapes of the Iberian Peninsula, where mountains cradle ancient castles and rivers whisper the echoes of long-lost empires. This is not a story of one battle or a single king. No, it is a story that stretches across centuries. A slow-burning epic filled with devotion, defiance, betrayal, and belief. A tale where Christian kingdoms rose in the shadow of Moorish palaces, and desert winds carried the scent of spices, ink, and blood across contested lands. This is the story of the Reconquista. For over 700 years, the Christians of northern Iberia fought, at times with sword and shield, at times with patience and faith, to reclaim the land they believed was once theirs. But it was never simple. The history is tangled with moments of coexistence, alliances across faiths, noble rivalries, and unthinkable betrayals. Tonight, I'll guide you through that long night of history when minarets shimmered under the stars of Al-Andalus and distant church bells rang defiantly in the misty mountains of Asturias. You'll meet warrior monks, exiled emirs, scheming queens, and knights with both steel and scripture in their hearts. And as the fires of Granada flicker toward the story's end, we'll witness the birth of a new world and the closing of an old one. So, wherever you are, maybe you're lying in bed in a quiet city apartment, or curled up in a cottage far from noise. Perhaps the wind taps your window, or your fan hums softly beside you. From where are you watching this history? What time is it now, as you begin this journey into the deep, echoing past? Leave a comment. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. And if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe, so you'll always have a doorway into the forgotten corners of history when the world is quiet and your mind needs something slow, rich, and ancient to drift into. Now get comfortable. Let the day slip away behind you. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. Close your eyes and let the mists of time draw you back to a world on the cusp of transformation. Before the crescents of Al-Andalus shimmered on mosque domes, before Castilian knights marched beneath crimson banners, there was another Iberia. A quieter, older land fractured, but full of memory. This was the world of the Visigoths. The year is sometime in the late 600s, in the twilight of the 7th century. Iberia, what we now call Spain and Portugal, rests under the rule of the Visigothic kingdom, a Germanic people who centuries earlier had descended into the former Roman provinces like windswept leaves after a storm. When the Western Roman Empire fell, it was the Visigoths who claimed the peninsula as their own. But what they inherited was not just land. It was an aging soul of stone and scripture. The great Roman roads still wound their way across the hills and valleys. Crumbling aqueducts still stood like weary sentinels over rivers and plains. Latin was still spoken in its softer, local tongues. Christianity, particularly, The Nicene form accepted by Rome had already rooted itself deeply into the culture, replacing the older pagan rites. The churches of Hispania glowed with candlelight and echoed with chants. Monasteries dotted the countryside, preserving not only holy texts, but fragments of lost classical knowledge. It was, in a sense, the Roman world, reborn under barbarian crowns. But if you listened closely, beyond the hymns and market chatter, you could hear the whispers of fracture. The Visigothic kingdom was not a picture of strength. Power shifted uneasily between kings, nobles, and bishops. Succession was not hereditary, but elective, a dangerous game in a kingdom filled with ambitious lords and scheming clergy. Civil wars were not uncommon. Conspiracies brewed like storm clouds. Assassinations were not the exception, but the pattern. One king after another struggled to assert unity. Some ruled for only a few years before being deposed, imprisoned, or murdered. Others tried desperately to centralize power by leaning on the church, forming what some historians would call a theocratic monarchy. The church became both spiritual guide and political sword. Councils were convened not just to discuss doctrine, but to judge treason and bless kingship. And amid all this, a deeper tension simmered beneath the soil: the presence of the Jews. Jewish communities had existed in Iberia for centuries, in cities like Merida, Toledo, and Tarragona. They worked as merchants, scribes, farmers, even physicians. But under Visigothic rule, especially in the later years, they became convenient scapegoats for royal instability. Anti-Jewish laws grew harsher. Forced conversions, confiscations, and expulsions became common, justified as acts of religious purification. These seeds of division would have echoes far into the future. Yet, even in turmoil, there was beauty in this fading world. Imagine a spring morning in Toledo, the royal capital perched above the Tagus River. The fog lifts as sunlight spills over red-tiled rooftops and glints off the armor of a passing guardsman. Bells chime from a nearby church as children race through narrow streets, their laughter mingling with the calls of vendors offering olives, honey, and smoked fish. Inside a scriptorium, a monk carefully copies the Book of Psalms in Visigothic script, his hand steady despite the tremble of old age. It was a world still trying to find balance between the sword and the cross, the Roman and the Gothic, the sacred and the political. But even as life continued, distant rumblings stirred beyond the sea. In the deserts of Arabia, a new religion had arisen, Islam. Within mere decades, Muslim armies had swept across the Middle East and North Africa, faster than anyone in Iberia could have imagined. And in 711, with barely a whisper of warning, that storm would crash onto the Iberian shores. But before we get there, let us speak of one final figure, a king whose name would be remembered not for his deeds, but for his downfall. Rodrigo. He was not a tyrant. He was not especially cruel, nor particularly weak. He was simply the last, crowned in a time of deep division. Rodrigo's rule was contested from the beginning. Some nobles supported him. Others backed rival claimants. And while Rodrigo's army was distracted by rebellion in the north, a Muslim force landed at Gibraltar. The kingdom was not ready, and perhaps it never had been. And yet this moment, this tragic decline, was not inevitable. History is never a straight line, no matter how much we try to draw it as such. The Visigothic kingdom might have endured. Perhaps a stronger king could have united the lords, repelled the invaders, and rewritten the fate of Spain. But that is not the story that unfolded. Instead, we walk the path that was chosen as twilight falls over the last Visigothic court. Candles flicker in anxious silence. Somewhere, a messenger rides hard from the coast, bearing news of an approaching army dressed in silk and steel, with crescent banners fluttering over desert-trained horses, and the long night begins. Dawn breaks over the southern coast of Iberia, not with the quiet rustle of a new day, but with the faint, rhythmic sound of oars cutting through waves. The year is 711. The warm breeze carries with it a scent unfamiliar to the shores of Hispania. Sandalwood, frankincense, distant spices from African markets. On this particular morning, near the rocky outcrop known as Jabal E60, a Macron, RIQ, what we now call Gibraltar, a fleet of small vessels touches land. Their passengers are not mere traders or pilgrims. They are soldiers, riders, veterans of the desert. At their head is a man named E60, a Macron, RIQ, Ibn Ziyad, a Berber commander, loyal to the Umayyad governor of Ifriqiya, modern-day Tunisia. His mission is not entirely clear even to his men. Was it an invasion, a raid, a reconnaissance? Perhaps it began as one and became the other, but history rarely announces its most fateful chapters as such. They say, perhaps apocryphally, that upon reaching the Iberian coast, E60, a Macron RIQ, ordered the ships burned. "Behind you is the sea," he told his warriors. "Before you, the enemy." There would be no turning back. The enemy, as he called them, was the Visigothic kingdom, already staggering under the weight of its own divisions. Word had reached E60, a Macron, RIQ, that the Gothic nobility was fractured, that a dispute over the crown had left key lords at odds with their king, Rodrigo. It was whispered that one noble family, perhaps out of spite or calculation, had invited the Muslims to intervene. And in that vacuum of unity, the fate of Iberia would pivot. E60, a Macron RIQ's army, was small by the standards of conquest. Perhaps 7,000 men, mostly Berbers, like him, newly converted to Islam, hardened by mountain warfare. Some Arab cavalrymen joined later under another commander, Musa ibn Nu, E63, a YR. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in agility, discipline, and a kind of religious fire that had driven Muslim armies across continents in a matter of years. The first major engagement came at the Battle of Guadalete. Rodrigo met the invaders with a larger force, perhaps double the size. He wore a golden crown into battle. His standard fluttered in the wind. His warriors formed in thick Gothic ranks, prepared for a conventional fight. But fate, it seems, had other plans. The fighting was fierce, but crucially, some of Rodrigo's allies turned on him mid-battle. A betrayal, a calculated ploy. Whatever the cause, the Visigothic line broke. Rodrigo vanished from the chronicles of history. Some say he was killed, his body never found. Others claimed he fled, living out his days in exile or penance. In the chaos of defeat, his kingdom unraveled almost overnight. And then the floodgates opened. City after city fell with stunning speed. Córdoba, Toledo, Mérida, Zaragoza. The Muslim advance moved like a tide, sometimes met with resistance, often welcomed by the disaffected, or surrendered to without a fight. Many local populations, weary of Visigothic rule or sympathetic to the new rulers, opened their gates. Jews, in particular, who had suffered persecution under Christian law, often aided the Muslim advance or served as administrators in the newly conquered cities. To understand the shock of this conquest, you must picture the emotional weight of its swiftness. Imagine living in a small Iberian village where the church bell rings every morning, where the crops follow the cycle of saints' days. 1 week, your lords speak Gothic. The next, Arabic echoes from the palace walls. Taxes change hands. Rules shift, but life quietly adapts. And yet, for many, the transition was not violent. Letter 1E60, A Macron RIQ, and his successors did not impose mass conversions. Islam, in its early expansion, was not built on forced faith, but on governance, taxation, and political allegiance. Christians and Jews were granted dhimmi status, protected peoples, allowed to practice their religion in exchange for a special tax, the jizya. Some converted, yes, but many remained as they were, living under what came to be known as Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus. By 718, in less than a decade, the majority of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. It was one of the most rapid conquests in recorded history. But here, let us pause not to summarize, but to feel. Imagine the silence that follows such a storm. In churches, candles still burned. In markets, people still bartered for figs, grain, and copper. But over the hills now came different riders, different laws, a different calendar. And yet, the land did not revolt. Why? Because empires rise not only on conquest, but on the ability to hold, to govern, to adapt. And the early rulers of Al-Andalus were nothing if not shrewd. They kept local structures. They preserved city charters. They maintained order. Arabic became the language of state, but Latin and the evolving Romance tongues endured in homes and hearts. A new world had been born quietly, completely. But not all fled to submission. Far to the north, in the wet, wooded hills of Asturias, Christian nobles and peasants retreated into the misty folds of the mountains. Among them stirred a murmur of resistance, of faith, of vengeance. Their voices were faint, but growing, because even as the sword of Islam swept across the land, the spark of the cross had not been extinguished, only hidden. And in the shadow of this new dawn, the seeds of centuries-long struggle began to take root. The sword conquers, but it is the pen that builds. In the aftermath of war, the land once known as Hispania did not fall into ruin. Instead, something extraordinary began to take shape, graceful, vibrant, and dazzling in its contrast to what had come before. Al-Andalus. That was the name the new rulers gave to the Iberian Peninsula, though even they were uncertain of its origin. Some believed it came from the Vandals, who once roamed this region. Others thought it meant something older, more mysterious. Regardless, the word would become a symbol of both wonder and conflict, a place where stars reflected off mosque domes and poetry flowed as freely as blood. After the rapid conquest, the region became a province of the Umayyad Caliphate, whose capital lay far to the east in Damascus. Governors were appointed to oversee Al-Andalus, and for a time, the land functioned like many other far-flung territories of the Caliphate, remote, yet loyal. But Al-Andalus was not like the rest. Here, the soil was different, the cultures layered, the languages tangled, the people Visigoths, Hispano-Romans, Jews, Berbers, Arabs did not blend overnight. But over time, something rare occurred, not just conquest, but a kind of synthesis. A meeting of minds, tongues, and souls. The new rulers brought with them advanced systems of irrigation, unknown crops, and architectural techniques refined in the deserts of the Middle East. Soon, southern Iberia blossomed with orange groves, rice fields, and cotton farms. The air grew thick with the scent of jasmine and myrtle. Water became not just life, but art channeled through aqueducts, fountains, and gardens, designed to soothe both body and spirit. Cities flourished. Córdoba, in particular, would grow into one of the most sophisticated cities in the world, rivaling Constantinople and Baghdad. By the 10th century, it boasted paved streets, street lamps, public libraries, and bathhouses. Scholars, philosophers, and scientists gathered beneath its white minarets, debating the stars, logic, and the soul. But these marvels did not rise overnight. In the first decades of Muslim rule, there was still tension, especially between Arabs and Berbers. Though both were Muslim, the Berbers, who had done much of the conquering, often felt sidelined by their Arab counterparts. Rebellions broke out. Power shifted uneasily, and when the Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown in Damascus in 750, Al-Andalus stood on the brink of uncertainty. That is, until a fugitive arrived. Letter 2BF, a BD, Alar letter 1E25MA Macron N. I, a young Umayyad prince, escaped the Abbasid purge that wiped out his dynasty in the east. After a perilous journey through Africa, he crossed the sea into Al-Andalus in 755. Charismatic, clever, and driven by the weight of his lineage, he rallied Arab and Berber factions under his banner. Within a few years, he established himself as the emir of Córdoba, founding a dynasty that would rule for centuries. Under letter 2BF, a BD Alar letter 1E25MA Macron N and his successors, the emirate stabilized. But it was not just politics they cultivated. It was culture. In the capital, the great mosque of Córdoba rose, a masterpiece of architecture. Its double-tiered arches, built with alternating red and white stone, evoked the rhythm of music and mathematics. Light spilled through its countless columns like water through a grove. Even today, it stuns those who enter not simply with grandeur, but with grace. This was the soul of Al-Andalus, not just military might, but aesthetic brilliance, a civilization that saw beauty as divine. And it was not just Muslims who thrived. Christians and Jews lived within this world as dhimmis, protected peoples. Though subject to a special tax and legal limitations, they were allowed to worship freely, govern their own communities, and often rose to positions of great influence. Many Christians began to speak Arabic fluently, wear Muslim dress, and even write poetry in the Islamic style. They were called Mozarabs, a name that meant Arabized. Some saw it as betrayal, others as adaptation. Meanwhile, Jews flourished in this new environment, serving as physicians, translators, merchants, and advisors to emirs. The Sephardic Jewish tradition, so central to Jewish history, was born in the libraries and courtyards of Al-Andalus. And the arts, oh, the arts. Andalusian music, influenced by Arab, Berber, and local Iberian melodies, gave rise to hauntingly beautiful compositions. Lutes, flutes, and rhythmic clapping, what we now know as the earliest roots of flamenco, echoed through palaces and courtyards. Poets spoke of love, wine, gardens, and God in verses so tender, they blurred the line between the sacred and the sensual. And yet, even in this golden age, shadows lingered. There were moments of repression. At times, Christian communities rebelled. Some martyrs, known as the Martyrs of Córdoba, deliberately blasphemed Islam to provoke execution, hoping to reignite Christian resistance. Their blood stirred memory and perhaps resentment. Moreover, the unity of Al-Andalus was always fragile. Beneath the surface, tensions brewed between Arab and Berber, ruler and rebel, orthodox and mystic. Though Córdoba gleamed, the northern Christian kingdoms, tiny and fragmented, had not vanished. In the misty mountains, their fires still burned, waiting for the moment to grow. But let us not rush there yet. Let us rest for a while in the gardens of Al-Andalus, under an olive tree heavy with fruit. A scholar nearby recites lines from Aristotle, translated from Greek to Arabic. His Christian colleague takes notes, preparing a Latin version. A Jewish doctor mixes herbs for a feverish child. A Muslim calligrapher sharpens his pen to copy a Quranic verse in gold leaf. Here, for this fleeting moment, civilizations breathe together. It will not last forever. No world does. But for now, in this chapter of the night, Al-Andalus has risen, full of promise and paradox. And somewhere, far to the north, a small Christian stronghold prepares to whisper its own story into the darkness. In the far northern reaches of Iberia, where rugged peaks cut into the clouds and rivers rush through dense forests, a different world endured. Unlike the plains and palaces of Al-Andalus, this land was wild, humid, and tangled. It did not submit easily, and it did not forget. Here, in the steep terrain of Asturias, the seeds of something ancient began to stir, something born not of conquest, but of survival. After the sweeping victory of Muslim forces across the peninsula, it seemed all was lost for the old Christian order. The Visigothic nobility had been shattered. Their king had vanished. The church, once the soul of the land, now operated quietly under the terms of its new rulers. Yet, not all had bowed their heads. Many of the Gothic survivors, clergy, and local lords fled north, seeking refuge not just in terrain, but in tradition. The mountains had always been a borderland, even in Roman times. Hard to govern, harder still to conquer. And nestled within those green, rain-soaked ridges, the fire of Christian resistance was lit by a man whose name would echo for centuries, Pellew. What we truly know of Pellew is veiled in the haze of both legend and scarcity. Some accounts say he was a nobleman of Visigothic descent, perhaps a former page in the Visigothic court, or even a member of the royal guard. Others cast him in a more mythic light. A lone warrior chosen by fate, emerging from the ashes of a fallen kingdom to defy the tide of history. Whatever his origins, Pellew did something no other had dared. He said no. In the early 720s, he gathered a small band of fighters, Christian locals, fugitive nobles, peasants, and monks, and established a base of resistance in the Picos de Europa, a cluster of jagged mountains cloaked in mist and pine. His cause was not grand. Not yet. It was not to retake Iberia. It was merely to endure. Muslim forces, hearing of this defiance, were unimpressed. A small detachment was sent to suppress the rebellion. After all, what threat could a few rebels pose to the might of the Umayyad armies? But in the mountains, numbers mean little. The terrain itself becomes a weapon. And here, in a narrow gorge near the cave shrine of Covadonga, the fate of Iberia took an unexpected turn. The Muslim column advanced, confident, perhaps careless. The rebels lay hidden above the pass, among the trees and cliffs. As the soldiers entered the gorge, rocks rained from above. Then arrows. Then the rebels themselves descended, swords flashing, cries echoing off stone. The enemy panicked. Horses faltered. The gorge became a trap, and the force, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, was cut down. It was not a grand battle, not by size, not by numbers, but in meaning. It was a thunderclap in the stillness of despair. The Battle of Covadonga, as it came to be known, marked the first Christian victory in the long war that would later be called the Reconquista. It was more than a skirmish, it was a statement. The cross had not been extinguished. Pellew, emboldened by this victory, declared himself king. Not of all Iberia, that dream was far off, but of Asturias, a small Christian kingdom nestled in the mist. He and his successors would fortify their hold on the region, turning the mountains into both refuge and citadel. But they were not alone for long. As years passed, more Christians from the south, weary of living under Muslim rule, made the treacherous journey north. Some came with families, others with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a hope for a new beginning. They brought stories, relics, songs, and customs, braiding together the old Visigothic past with the mountain present. The kingdom of Asturias, forged in defiance, became more than a resistance. It became a symbol. Monasteries sprang up along the ridges. Latin scripture was preserved in smoky candlelight. Bells rang again, not across cities, but from valleys and peaks. The faith, battered but unbroken, found sanctuary in stone chapels clinging to the sides of cliffs. And slowly, the dream began to stretch. Asturias, under Pellew's successors, such as Alfonso I and Alfonso II, began raiding southward. Not as conquerors yet, but as reminders. They took advantage of internal Muslim strife. They captured small towns, fortified border posts, spread their influence into Galicia and Leon. And though the Muslims still held the overwhelming majority of the land, the Christian voice had returned to the conversation. Still, for the moment, these Christian realms remained minor shadows against the grandeur of Al-Andalus. The contrast was stark. In the south, Córdoba glittered with philosophy and poetry. In the north, wooden crosses were raised among howling winds. In the south, tiled courtyards shimmered under starlight. In the north, fires crackled in stone hearths as warriors read from the Psalms. Each world barely touched the other, yet each was aware of its rival. It is easy, looking back, to paint this as a clean division. Muslim versus Christian, South versus North. But reality is always messier. There were alliances across faiths, traders who moved between realms, pilgrims who journeyed through lands not their own, even warriors at times who served lords of another religion. Still, the narrative had begun. Covadonga became a legend, a sacred myth. Chroniclers, writing centuries later, would elevate it to a divine moment. They would say that the Virgin Mary herself protected Pellew, that the rocks of Covadonga held God's breath, that this battle marked the beginning of Christian redemption. Whether true or embellished, the story held power. Because every great movement begins with a story, and Covadonga, became that for the Reconquista. So when you stand today before the cave shrine where Pelio is said to have knelt, and hear the rush of the waterfall beside it, know this: you are hearing the heartbeat of a people who refused to vanish. And in the darkness of uncertainty, they carved out a sliver of light, one that would only grow brighter with each passing generation. The Iberian Peninsula, in the centuries after the conquest, was not a simple map of enemies and allies. It was a chessboard of shifting powers, loyalties, and faiths, constantly rearranged by wind, will, and war. To live in this land was to know contradiction. It was to see the crescent moon rising over a minaret and a cross etched on a distant hilltop. This was not just a battleground. It was a meeting ground. By the early 800s, Iberia had settled into a strange and delicate rhythm. The Muslim south, known as Al-Andalus, was ruled by the powerful Umayyad Emirate in Córdoba, soon to become a caliphate in its own right. The Christian north, once a narrow mountain refuge, had begun to sprawl cautiously across new frontiers. But the borders were not walls. They were rivers, valleys, and plains lines that breathed, shifted, and sometimes disappeared entirely. What emerged in this long middle period was not simply a war of civilizations, but something much more tangled. Yes, there were battles. There were raids. Christian kings would gather armies to march south, and Muslim generals would strike north in turn. Fortresses were built, burned, and rebuilt. But just as often, there were treaties, marriages, trade caravans winding between Córdoba and León, Granada and Pamplona. Diplomacy moved quietly where swords had once clashed. In this land of cross and crescent, the unexpected was common. Christian kings sometimes hired Muslim mercenaries to fight other Christians. Muslim emirs made alliances with Christian lords to crush rebellious Muslim rivals. The world was not divided by clear moral lines. It was guided by need, opportunity, and survival. Take, for example, the Mulades, native Iberians who converted to Islam. Some did so to avoid taxation, others for social advancement, and many out of genuine belief. These converts formed an important part of Andalusian society, often rising to positions of influence. At the same time, Christian communities within Muslim lands, Mozarabs, continued to practice their faith, preserving Latin liturgy and customs, even as they adopted Arabic as their spoken language. And then there were the frontier towns, places like Toledo, Zaragoza, and Badajoz, where cultures rubbed shoulders daily. In these melting pots, one might hear the call to prayer and the pealing of church bells in the same hour. One might see a Christian craftsman designing tilework for a mosque, or a Muslim physician treating the wounds of a Christian knight. The borderlands were alive with paradox. The Christian kingdoms Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and later Castile were not always united. Far from it. Rivalries among them were fierce. Kings and counts squabbled over territory, marriages, and succession. Occasionally, they even warred with each other, while the Muslim South stood united, or vice versa. And yet, out of this disorder came something extraordinary, a slow, uneven blending of traditions. Architecture tells the story clearly. Walk through an early Christian church in Leon or Burgos, and you may find horseshoe arches borrowed directly from Islamic design. The great cathedrals of later centuries would be built by craftsmen who had learned their skills shaping the domes and courtyards of mosques. Language, too, absorbed the mosaic. Thousands of Arabic words found their way into the evolving Romance tongues, especially in fields like science, agriculture, mathematics, and music. Words like almohada, pillow, aceituna, olive, ajdres, chess, and naranja, orange, remain today as living echoes of that mingling. Even clothing bore the mark. Christian nobles in the north often wore robes and tunics of Muslim design, embroidered with silken thread. Andalusian fashion, elegant, flowing, light, spread like perfume across borders. Yet, despite these points of contact, tension never truly faded. Beneath the surface of coexistence, there were always embers of division. For every peaceful marketplace, there was a skirmish. For every marriage of faiths, a denunciation. The Christian kingdoms still dreamed of reconquest. The Muslim emirs of eternal dominion. Religion was both bridge and barrier. In the courts of Córdoba, Muslim scholars studied the works of Plato, Galen, and Ptolemy, translated from Greek to Arabic, preserved in libraries that shone with wisdom. But in the monasteries of the north, monks copied scripture by hand, line after sacred line, preserving the flame of Christian theology and Latin memory. Both sides saw themselves as guardians of truth, and sometimes that truth clashed. In the mid-800s, a group of Christians in Córdoba deliberately began to insult Islam in public, declaring the divinity of Christ loudly in front of mosques, condemning Mohammed in front of qadis or judges. These men and women were arrested, tried, and executed. They became known as the martyrs of Córdoba. Their actions stirred debate even among Christians. Some saw them as saints, others as provocateurs. Muslim leaders, for the most part, tolerated Christianity under the dhimmi system. But public blasphemy could not be ignored. The incident revealed the limits of tolerance and the fragility of peace. Still, Iberia did not descend into chaos. It moved on quietly, stubbornly through its contradictions. Through the drizzle of mountain passes and the scorching heat of the southern plains. Through treaties signed with blood and broken with sighs. This was not a war of day and night. It was the long twilight of a peninsula torn between two worlds, and often walking in both. For the listener drifting into rest, it may seem strange, this idea that for centuries people lived on the edge of empires and ideologies and still managed to live. But such is the lesson of history. People will always find ways to endure, to love, to sing, to worship, even amid tension, even amid fear. And so the story of the Reconquista deepened, not as a straight line of conquest, but as a web of kings, caliphs, bishops, emirs, farmers, and poets, each pulling threads in different directions. In this tangled net of humanity, one man, neither saint nor demon, would rise, whose legend would one day overshadow them all, a man who served both cross and crescent. His name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, but the world would come to call him something else. El Cid. The mountains, though majestic, divide more than they unite, as the Christian presence in Iberia grew from the stubborn seed of Asturias. It did not bloom as one single tree, but rather as a forest, each branch reaching in its own direction, each root tangled with another. What emerged in the north was not a single reconquering power, but a mosaic of competing kingdoms, each with its own kings, customs, and crowns. These were the lands of Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, and their story is as much one of struggle against one another as against the southern Muslim powers. The kingdom of Asturias, forged by Pelleau and his descendants, began to grow beyond its mountainous cradle in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Under King Alfonso II and his successors, its power pushed west into Galicia and east toward the plateau of Leon. In time, the name Asturias gave way to a new identity, Leon. Leon became a proper kingdom, a political center, rather than just a stronghold. Its rulers styled themselves as heirs to the Visigoths, and in their charters, they often invoked the memory of old Hispania, but it was an inheritance more aspirational than literal. For Leon, though powerful, was not alone. To its east rose Castile, originally not a kingdom, but a rugged county, a marchland, populated by hardy frontiersmen and fiercely independent nobles. The name itself comes from the Latin casella, meaning land of castles, and indeed, the region was dotted with fortresses, each perched atop its own rocky defiance. Castile had been given to Leon as a protective border, but borders do not stay loyal forever. By the 10th century, Castile was flexing its own muscles, and its counts, especially the powerful Fernán González, began to act with the authority of kings. Over time, Castile would grow in might and pride, becoming both Leon's rival and partner, depending on the winds of marriage and war. To the northeast, shielded by the Pyrenees, the kingdom of Navarre took shape, an old land with a soul of its own. Navarre's people were Basques, speaking a language older than Latin or Arabic, older than history itself. Isolated by geography, proud and elusive, Navarre straddled both Iberia and the reaches of France. It allied with Frankish rulers at times, and later with Aragonese and Castilians, always playing its hand with caution and grit. And beside Navarre, rising like a small but determined sibling, was Aragon, first a county, then a kingdom. Its lands stretched into the dry, sun-soaked valleys that would one day hold Zaragoza. Though Aragon began small, its ambition would prove immense. In time, it would be one of the pillars of Christian expansion. But in these early centuries, none of these kingdoms could claim supremacy. Instead, the north was a stage of constant motion. Kings married queens to unite lands, then quarreled with their heirs and split them again. Brothers fought brothers over inheritances. Nobles played kingmakers, switching loyalties when it suited them. At times, kings ruled 2 or even 3 crowns, only for those crowns to fracture again at their death. Power here was as fluid as the rivers that ran down from the Cantabrian and Pyrenean ranges. But even amid this tangle of rivalry, there was growth. Christian courts began to adopt more structured forms of law and governance. Monasteries flourished, not just as centers of prayer, but of education, translation, and diplomacy. The monastery of San Millán de la Cagala, for instance, produced some of the earliest written examples of Castilian, a language still in its infancy, shaped by Latin, Arabic, and the speech of soldiers and shepherds. It is in these courts, between oaths sworn by candlelight and feasts held in stone halls, that we see the slow formation of a northern identity, deeply Catholic, fiercely martial, and shaped by both reverence and rivalry. And then there was the church. The Christian kingdoms saw themselves as the guardians of true faith on the peninsula. Their bishops worked to align more closely with Rome, even as the Mozarabic rites of Old Hispania persisted in the background. Pilgrimages began to grow in popularity, especially to the shrine of Santiago de Compostela, where the relics of Saint James were said to lie. The cult of Santiago became a rallying point. The Apostle James, reimagined as a warrior saint, Santiago Matamoros, the Moorslayer, was said to appear on battlefields, urging Christian armies to victory. Whether myth or miracle, this imagery gave the Reconquista a divine dimension. It was not merely political, but sacred. Yet, for all their religiosity and resolve, the Christian kingdoms remained fractured. And this, ironically, became both their weakness and their strength. When one king fell, another rose to fill the void. When one kingdom lost ground, its neighbor might seize it. No single defeat ever crushed the northern cause, because there was no single center. The Reconquista, at this stage, was not a national project. It was a patchwork of ambitions, grudges, and dreams, each pulling the cause forward, piece by piece. And among these courts, roaring fires warming wet stone, hounds sleeping near their masters, lords hunched over maps, rose men of iron, commanders who learned to fight not in open fields, but in mountain skirmishes, frontier raids, and sudden sieges. It was a land that rewarded cunning and courage in equal measure, and from this soil of instability, one figure would rise not from royalty, but from loyalty. Not a king, but a warrior whose legend would eclipse many kings. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, born near Burgos, raised in the court of Leon and Castile, Rodrigo would become the embodiment of the Christian knight. But his path would not be simple. He would serve Muslims and Christians alike. He would win glory and fall into disgrace. He would command armies, lose everything, and reclaim more. His name would echo not only in the halls of Spain, but across Europe and into the pages of myth. They called him El Cid Campeador, the Lord, the master of the battlefield. But before we ride beside him, let us step quietly into his world, a world of loyalty and exile, faith and contradiction, steel and story, because in the tangled thicket of Christian rivalry and ambition, El Cid would forge a name not in marble, but in memory. He was born not in a palace, but near the wind-swept fields of Castile, in a village called Vivar, not far from the old city of Burgos. The year was around 1043. His name was Rodrigo Diaz, the son of a minor nobleman, raised in the charged air of the frontier, where the scent of war lingered like smoke in every season. Rodrigo's youth was shaped not by books, but by blades. He came of age in a land always braced for battle, a land where every sunrise might bring news of raids, uprisings, or uneasy truces broken by greed or vengeance. He entered the court of King Ferdinand I of Leon and Castile as a young page, his eyes wide, his heart steady. In time, he would become the standard-bearer of Ferdinand's son, Sancho II, a bold and ambitious prince. It was here that Rodrigo's legend began to stir. Sancho was not content to share his father's legacy with his siblings. Upon Ferdinand's death, the kingdom was divided. Leon went to Alfonso, Galicia to Garcia, and Castile to Sancho. But Sancho had other plans. He sought to reunite the fractured realm under his own banner. Rodrigo became his champion, his campeador, the master of the battlefield. The campaigns were brutal. Brother turned against brother, each believing destiny was on their side. Rodrigo fought with a clarity and fury that marked him as more than just a warrior. He was methodical, fearless, calculating. His sword sang in sieges, his voice rallied men from despair, and his loyalty to Sancho was absolute. But fate, as always, had other ideas. In 1072, after a series of swift victories, Sancho was assassinated, cut down outside the gates of Zamora, a city held by his sister, Araca. The treachery was whispered about in corners, never spoken aloud. And with Sancho's death, his brother Alfonso VI returned from exile in Toledo to claim the crown of Leon and Castile. Rodrigo now found himself in a new world. No longer the favored knight, he had to kneel before the very king his sword had once opposed. The moment was tense, legendary even. Some say that Rodrigo, on behalf of the Castilian nobles, forced Alfonso to swear publicly that he had no part in Sancho's death. The oath of Santa Gadia, as it came to be known, was never written down, but it lived in stories, burning with tension. Alfonso accepted Rodrigo's service, but distrust brewed beneath the surface. Rodrigo was too popular, too powerful, too independent. In 1081, that distrust came to a head, accused of conducting an unauthorized raid against the Muslim Taifa of Toledo. Then, under Alfonso's protection, Rodrigo was banished, exiled, cast out from the court, stripped of lands and title. The knight who had once stood at the heart of Castile now wandered the frontiers alone, and yet exile did not break him. It remade him. Rodrigo turned south into Al-Andalus, into the very world he had once fought against. But the lines between Christian and Muslim were not as rigid as tales might suggest. The Taifas, the small, fragmented Muslim kingdoms that had replaced the fallen caliphate of Córdoba, were desperate. Many hired Christian mercenaries to defend them, and Rodrigo offered more than just his sword. He offered strategy, discipline, victory. He entered the service of Al-Mu'tamid, the ruler of Seville, and later of the Taifa of Zaragoza. To the Muslims, he became known as Al-Sayyid, the Lord. The Spanish would reshape this into El-Cid, a name that carried dust, blood, and fire in its wake. His enemies, Christian and Muslim alike, feared him. His men followed him with devotion. And over the years, he became more than a knight. He became a symbol, a force unto himself. Still, Rodrigo never lost sight of his own ambitions. He maneuvered through alliances and betrayals with uncanny precision. He played kings and emirs against each other, not out of malice, but survival, always thinking, always moving. In 1086, a new force arrived in Iberia from across the sea, the Almoravids, fierce Berber warriors from North Africa, summoned by the Taifas to halt Alfonso's advances. But the Almoravids were not interested in saving Al-Andalus. They came to conquer, to purify. Their victory at the Battle of Sagrajas sent shockwaves through both Christian and Muslim realms, and El-Cid, watching from the sidelines, saw opportunity. He turned his gaze toward Valencia, a wealthy, independent city caught in the currents of fear and ambition. For years, he worked his influence, tightening a slow siege, gathering troops, building power. In 1094, after years of careful maneuvering, El-Cid captured Valencia not for any king, but for himself. He ruled the city as a prince, independent, neither vassal nor servant. He governed Muslims and Christians alike, maintaining order with a firm but fair hand. In this city of palm trees, fountains, and distant drums, Rodrigo Diaz had built his own domain. For 5 years, El-Cid ruled Valencia. His wife, Jimna, joined him there. His children grew. The city flourished under his control. And yet, the pressure never ceased. The Almoravids advanced. Alfonso's favor remained cold. And then, in 1099, El-Cid died. He passed not in battle, but in bed, old, tired, and worn from a life carved across the edge of a sword. Legend, of course, refused to let him go so quietly. One tale says that after his death, his wife Jimna had his body dressed in armor, mounted on his horse, and sent out one last time, terrifying the besieging Almoravid forces into retreat. Whether true or not, the image has endured. Alcide, riding even in death. His body was later moved to Burgos, where it rests still. His sword, Tizona, remains one of Spain's most treasured relics. But more than relics, Alcide left behind a legacy carved in myth and memory. He was neither saint nor sinner. He fought for kings who distrusted him and emirs who admired him. He was called traitor by some, savior by others. He served Christendom, and he served himself. And in doing so, he became the very spirit of the age, a mirror to the Reconquista itself. Complex, conflicted, caught between worlds. Even centuries later, minstrels would sing of him, poets would pen verses, historians would argue over every detail. But for the people of his time, and for us listening now in the stillness of night, Alcide stands as a reminder that the stories that shape history are rarely clean, rarely easy. They are layered, they are lived, they are human. And as the memory of Alcide fades into the desert winds of Valencia, the Reconquista is far from over. The tide is beginning to turn, and the Christian kingdoms are rising again. The dust of Valencia had barely settled from the death of Alcide when new forces began to shift beneath the surface of Iberia. Time, like the tide, moves slowly, but when it turns, it can carry with it empires. By the early 12th century, the Iberian Peninsula had grown more turbulent, more crowded, and more volatile. New powers had risen across the Muslim south, sweeping in from beyond the sea with banners of reform and fury. The Almoravids, fierce Berber warriors from North Africa, had come first, but they were followed and soon replaced by an even more radical force, the Almohads. The Almohads were not content to rule. They believed themselves to be divine reformers, agents of purifying flame. They crushed the old Taifa kings, banned music, burned books, and enforced a strict interpretation of Islam. Their architecture was majestic, their theology unbending, their armies immense. They crossed from North Africa and built their new capital at Seville, where the Giralda Tower, now a cathedral bell tower, once echoed the call to prayer across orange groves and palaces. Their empire stretched from Marrakesh to Murcia, from the deserts of the Maghreb to the mountain passes of Aragon. And yet, for all their power, the Christian kingdoms had changed too. Gone were the days of fractured, feuding nobles too proud to unite. Now, a new generation of kings and queens had risen, educated, devout, and determined. The memory of Alcide still lingered in their halls, but their vision reached far beyond his campaigns. Alfonso VIII of Castile was one such king. He had inherited a kingdom bloodied and bruised, yet full of promise. And to the east, Peter II of Aragon, flamboyant and chivalrous, ruled with boldness. Even Sancho VII of Navarre, tall and silent, carried the pride of the Pyrenees in his heart. And in 1212, these kings did what their ancestors had failed to do for centuries. They united. The Pope himself, Innocent III, a master of diplomacy, and Crusade called for a holy war, not in the Holy Land, but in Spain. He declared the struggle against the Almohads to be a true crusade. Knights from France, Italy, and beyond poured across the Pyrenees, answering the call. What followed was not merely a battle, it was a reckoning. The Christian armies gathered like a slow-moving storm. Thousands of soldiers, nobles, squires, and monks marched south. Across the dry Castilian plains, banners snapping in the wind. At their head rode Alfonso VII, determined to redeem past failures and strike a blow that would be felt for generations. The target was Las Navas de Tolosa, a narrow pass in the Sierra Morena Mountains, guarded by the forces of the Almohad Caliph Mohammed al-Nasir, whom Christian sources would later call Muramamilin. Al-Nasir's army was vast, perhaps the largest assembled in Iberia to that point. Some say he brought 300,000 men, though modern historians suggest a smaller number. But even so, his force was immense, organized, and burning with zeal. The battle began on July 16, 1212. The Christian vanguard, led by Sancho of Navarre, pierced the mountain passes, surprising the Almohad scouts. Then, the main Christian force, led by Alfonso, advanced onto the high plains. For hours, the air was thick with dust and screams, with clashing steel and the crack of arrows. The Almohad troops fought with discipline, their cavalry swift and brutal. But the Christian ranks, for once, did not break. At the height of the battle, it is said that Sancho VII led a daring charge against the heart of the Muslim lines, straight toward the caliph's tent. His men tore through the black-cloaked bodyguards, known as the Chain Guard, for the iron links that bound them together in a ring around their caliph. Sancho broke the chain. The caliph fled. His army, seeing the breach, began to collapse. It was a decisive victory, perhaps the most decisive of the entire Reconquista. The Almohad dream in Iberia began to unravel from that day forward. Though they held Seville and Córdoba for a time, their aura of invincibility was shattered. Las Navas de Tolosa marked a moment when history leaned northward. Christian armies would no longer be satisfied with border raids or fragile truces. Now the gates to the southern heartlands had creaked open. And yet, even in triumph, the Christian kingdoms remained cautious. The road to Granada and to total reconquest was still long. The Almohads, though wounded, would linger for decades more. But the myth of Christian weakness had died on that battlefield. In the years that followed, one by one, key Muslim cities began to fall. Córdoba, the jewel of the old caliphate, would fall to Ferdinand III of Castile in 1236. Valencia, once ruled by Alcide, would fall again, this time to the Aragonese King James I, the conqueror, in 1238. Seville, grand and defiant, would finally fall in 1248. Each fall sent ripples through Christian Europe. Each conquest brought books, art, and architecture, sometimes preserved, sometimes repurposed. Mosques became cathedrals, palaces became castles, but always the land itself remembered what it had once been. Still, amid the rising Christian tide, one light of Al-Andalus remained. Granada, tucked into the hills of Andalusia, backed by the snowy peaks of the Sierra Nevada. Granada was a city of elegance, poetry, and cautious diplomacy. It would become the final bastion of Muslim rule in Iberia, a kingdom that endured through tribute, tact, and careful neutrality. But for now, in the glow of Las Navas de Tolosa, the Christians of Iberia saw the dream of unity and victory not as distant hopes, but as inevitable. They had tasted triumph not just on the field, but in the soul. They believed God had smiled upon them that day, and in their courts, their cathedrals, and their chronicles, they began to write a new story, one where the past belonged to Al-Andalus, but the future belonged to them. Yet dreams often deceive, and in the shadows of victory, new challenges would arise. Rival kings, jealous claims, and the haunting question of what to do with lands filled with people who prayed to a different god. And so, the Reconquista pressed on, not just as a war for land, but for identity. And in the stillness of Granada, the last sultan watched and waited. There was a time when the name QUR letter 1E60 UB whispered across the known world like a spell. It was a city of scholars and caliphs, of glimmering lanterns and silver-inlaid books. When the rest of Europe stumbled in the twilight of the early Middle Ages, Córdoba stood radiant, a beacon of intellect, tolerance, and splendor. By the 10th century, it was the crown of Al-Andalus, home to 500,000 souls. It housed over 70 libraries, hundreds of public baths, and streets lit by oil lamps, while Paris still crouched in shadows. But by the early 13th century, that brilliance had dimmed. The caliphate had shattered long ago. The Taifa kings who rose from its ashes ruled with vanity and fear. Then came the Almoravids, then the Almohads. Each new wave of rulers sought to restore Islamic unity. But with each wave, something was lost, an elegance, a subtlety, a confidence in coexistence. By the time Ferdinand III of Castile turned his eyes toward Córdoba, it was no longer the heart of an empire. It was tired, worn, beautiful still, but weighed down by the heavy silence of decline. Ferdinand, called El Santo, the saint, was no firebrand crusader. He was methodical, patient, and deeply devout. He did not ride with reckless pride like his ancestors. Instead, he built alliances, laid siege, and let time do the work of 1,000 swords. He ruled Castile and Leon, uniting two great kingdoms into one, a slow but critical step in the dream of a unified Christian Spain. In 1236, his forces encircled Córdoba. There was no grand charge, no heroic standoff. The siege was quiet, suffocating. The city had grown used to being a prize, passed from one hand to another. It still held the great mosque, the Mezquita, with its endless forest of red and white arches, its columns carved from ancient Roman ruins, its sacred mihrab glinting with gold and blue tiles brought from Byzantium. But walls and prayers could not hold forever. Inside the city, factions divided. The ruling Almohad governor lacked support. Christian sympathizers, perhaps Mozarabic Christians, long accustomed to living under Muslim rule, opened gates from within. On a cool January morning, Córdoba fell. No thunder of hooves, no clash of empires, just the quiet tread of Castilian boots on stone and the faint hush of centuries changing course. When Ferdinand entered the city, he did not destroy the Mezquita. He walked beneath its arches with awe and reverence. The building was converted into a cathedral, but its architecture was left intact, a whisper of the past left standing in the midst of conquest. Córdoba became Christian again, but its soul, what was left of it, remained tangled in the past. It was not just a military victory. It was a symbolic one. To take Córdoba was to claim the legacy of Al-Andalus itself. This city had once been the seat of the Umayyad Caliphate in Europe. It had rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople in learning and opulence. Its fall was the quiet announcement that the Reconquista had reached a deeper layer, not just of land, but of memory. Ferdinand established Christian institutions, built churches, and brought in settlers from the north. Arabic gave way to Latin. The call to prayer was silenced, but the buildings remained, silent witnesses to a vanished world. One can imagine a Muslim poet watching from the shadows, penning a final verse for his lost city. Something like, "The morning wind no longer carries the scent of jasmine. The arches sigh with memory, not joy. O Córdoba, pearl of the West, even your tears have turned to stone." And yet, even in conquest, Córdoba did not vanish. Its knowledge endured. Many texts, once written in Arabic, were translated into Latin, mathematics, astronomy, medicine. European scholars came to learn from its libraries. The West began to awaken, drawing from the deep well of Al-Andalus, even as it buried its name. Ferdinand, for his part, continued the march south. He would soon take Jaén, then Seville in 1248. He died in 1252, but by then, the balance of the peninsula had shifted so completely that the Christian kingdoms now ruled nearly all of Iberia, except for one, Granada. After Córdoba's fall, the Nasrid dynasty emerged from the ashes of Al-Andalus. Their emir, Mohammed ibn Nasr, known as Al-Amr, made a fateful decision to recognize Ferdinand's overlordship and pay tribute to Castile. In return, he was granted control over the southeastern corner of the peninsula, a small but defensible territory. He made his capital in Granada. There, against the slopes of the Sierra Nevada, he began to build a palace so beautiful, so dreamlike, that its very name would become legend, the Alhambra. It shimmered with intricate stucco, flowing water, and verses carved into its walls. "There is no conqueror but God," it said again and again. A reminder, a hope, a resignation. Granada would survive, but only just. As Córdoba faded into the annals of memory, Granada rose as the last light of Al-Andalus. A twilight kingdom, a place of poets and princes who lived under the constant shadow of Castilian power, a city whose beauty was matched only by its fragility. But we are not there yet. For now, we must pause. Listen to the silence left behind in Córdoba. Walk its old streets in the cool of night. Let your fingers brush the ancient stones. Smell the distant orange blossoms. Hear the echoes of Arabic verse drifting like smoke through the arches of the mezquita. The fall of Córdoba was not just the fall of a city, it was the fall of an age. And in its place, something new, something unfamiliar was rising. Not fully Christian, not fully Muslim, but something in between, a layered land, a haunted land, a land still dreaming of what it once was, and uncertain of what it would become. The Reconquista had entered its final century, and as Castile and Aragon grew stronger, Granada clung to its fragile peace, watched by the stars, guarded by lions carved in stone. But the silence would not last forever. Soon, ambition would rise again, and so would war. High in the hills of Andalusia, where the snow-capped Sierra Nevada watches over winding olive groves and ancient orchards, there lies a city woven from dreams, Granada. To the weary poets and wandering exiles of a fallen Córdoba, it was a place of refuge. To the defeated emirs of Seville and Murcia, it became a last hope, and to the Castilian kings, it was a pearl yet to be claimed, a glittering remnant of Al-Andalus, shining defiantly in the southern sun. Granada was not born of conquest, but of surrender. In the year 1238, the founder of the Nasrid dynasty, Mohammed ibn Nasr, made a fateful choice. Recognizing the overwhelming power of the Christian kingdoms, particularly that of Ferdinand III of Castile, he rode north to pledge loyalty. "There is no victor but God," he said humbly, echoing the words that would later be carved into the walls of his palace. His reward was autonomy, a small, mountainous corner of the peninsula, a chance to survive. So he returned to the south and built a kingdom not of grandeur, but of elegance, wit, and caution. Granada became a city that thrived not by might, but by diplomacy, and above it all, upon the red hill called Al-Sabica, he began to raise a palace, the Alhambra. To walk through the Alhambra even now, centuries later, is to step into another rhythm of time. Fountains whisper in secluded courtyards, slender columns rise like reeds, holding up ceilings carved with stars and lace-like stone. Light dances across tiled mosaics of turquoise, lapis, and gold. Arabic inscriptions swirl like poetry along the walls, verses from the Quran, lines of praise, soft prayers hidden in the corners. Here, power did not shout. It murmured. The Nasrid emirs were not powerful in the way of kings. They were vassals, sometimes loyal, sometimes rebellious, caught between survival and pride. They ruled over a fragile balance of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Their court was filled with mathematicians, calligraphers, mystics, and spies. Sometimes they paid tribute to Castile, other times they offered sanctuary to Castile's enemies. Granada, for over 2 centuries, became a land of clever neutrality, of cultural richness and strategic patience. But it was not without sorrow. To be the last light of a fallen world is a heavy burden. The people of Granada knew that the Reconquista was not over. They lived under its shadow. Each new Christian king, each campaign from the north, each rumor from court could spell the end of their fragile peace. And yet they built, they studied, they loved. They planted gardens and recited poetry. They debated philosophy and astronomy beneath the stars. The famous scholar Ibn al-Khatib once served as vizier in Granada. His writings spoke of the plague and politics, but also of the beauty of gardens and the nature of the soul. Granada was not just the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia. It was the soul of what Al-Andalus had once been. Its population was rich with artisans, builders, and merchants. The city became a hub of trade: silk, ceramics, sugar, and leather. From its ports, ships reached the Maghreb and the eastern Mediterranean. From its towers, messengers could see the movements of Christian armies miles away. But the world beyond was changing. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Castile and Aragon grew in wealth and ambition. The Black Death had passed. Feudal rivalries had dulled. Now the crowns were stronger, more centralized. Christian power was no longer a loose tapestry of warlords. It was a unified cloak of kings. And most of all, a union loomed: the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 was the beginning of the end. Together, they forged a singular, powerful Christian kingdom, determined to finish what had begun centuries ago in the mountains of Asturias. They believed it was their divine duty to complete the Reconquista. No more vassal states, no more tributes, no more Granada. But within the Alhambra, life went on. By now, the Nasrid dynasty had become entangled in internal feuds. Brothers and uncles turned against each other. Emirs rose and fell with dizzying speed. One prince, a quiet and melancholic figure, would one day become the last sultan of Granada. Boabdil, born Mohammed Exile, but remembered forever by the name whispered through Castilian ballads. His story was not one of glory, but of inevitability. And the Alhambra still shone. Its lions still stood guard in the marble courtyard. Its water still flowed in delicate channels across polished floors. The verses carved into its walls still sang of God's greatness and the fleeting nature of power. It was a palace not of war, but of grace, a fragile wonder cradled by the mountains. But outside its walls, the world was closing in. Ferdinand and Isabella had unified their armies. They had reformed their bureaucracy. They had brought in cannons, maps, and spies. They were no longer mere rulers of kingdoms. They were becoming architects of a nation. And Granada was the last stone in the arch. The Nasrid court, seeing the danger, sought alliances from the Maghreb. They promised gold, trade, loyalty, but little came. They turned to old Castilian allies, but none dared defy the Catholic monarchs. The roads were blocked. The fields were burned. The siege would come. Yet even then, Granada clung to life. Its people still prayed in the mosques. Poets still read by lantern light. Mothers still planted flowers along their windows. And in the high halls of the Alhambra, beneath the honeycombed ceilings, echoes of laughter and sorrow still drifted like incense. This was not a city defeated. It was a city waiting for the storm that had taken all of Al-Andalus to arrive at its door, waiting for the final page of a story written across 7 centuries. And in that stillness, Granada became eternal, a final flickering light, a dream carved in stone. But soon the dream would end. The siege would begin, and the last sultan would weep. Winter settled cold and patient upon the hills of southern Iberia. The Sierra Nevada loomed above the valley, its peaks veiled in snow, silent as the watchers of fate. Below, nestled in a fold of earth and sky, the red fortress of the Alhambra stood quiet. Smoke no longer rose freely from its towers. Laughter no longer echoed through its courts. It waited, proud and sorrowful, like a flame that knows it will be extinguished. It was the winter of 1491. The siege had begun. For 9 months, the city of Granada endured the slow tightening of fate's hand. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, had finally come to finish the long story begun by Visigothic survivors so many centuries ago. The Reconquista was to be completed, not with haste or glory, but with deliberate, calculated pressure. They had laid siege not merely with soldiers, but with systems. Ferdinand and Isabella commanded a modern army, backed by war chests, foreign support, and one of the first organized networks of military logistics in Europe. They brought gunpowder artillery, a new force in the Iberian theater. They constructed a fully functioning city, Santa Fe, just outside Granada's gates to serve as headquarters. This wasn't just war. This was an execution of inevitability. And within the walls of Granada, all eyes turned to Boabdil, the last sultan of Al-Andalus. He was a slender man, thoughtful and distant. To his supporters, he was a cautious tactician. To his enemies, a weak ruler caught between factions. To history, he would become a tragic figure, though perhaps he had simply been born too late, tasked with defending a flame already grown cold. Boabdil had inherited a broken legacy. His father, Abu el-Hasan Ali, and his uncle, Al-Zaghal, had turned the Nasrid dynasty into a palace of rivalries and betrayals. Granada's nobility was fractured. The once powerful emirate had become a stage of shifting loyalties and exhausted coffers. By the time Boabdil took the throne, after prison, exile, and a brief civil war, he was a ruler without choice. Still, he tried. The city's walls were strong, the people resilient. The Alhambra stood as a bastion of artistry and pride, but the noose tightened. The countryside had been scorched. Food dwindled. Morale faltered. Messages were intercepted. Allies failed to answer. One by one, the outer towns of the Nasrid domain fell. Loja, Maqlan, Alhama. The road to Granada was open. In the dark of December, emissaries began to pass between the two camps. Boabdil had no appetite for bloodshed. He sought to negotiate, if not for victory, then for dignity. And here, in the fading twilight of Al-Andalus, a strange thing occurred. Mercy. Ferdinand and Isabella, while driven by religious and nationalistic fervor, were also calculating. They wanted the city, they wanted peace, and they wanted Europe and God to see them as noble conquerors, not savage destroyers. The terms were agreed. Boabdil would surrender the city peacefully. In return, the Muslims of Granada would be allowed to keep their homes, their religion, their property. No forced conversions, no mass expulsions. The capitulations of Granada, as they were called, were sealed with oaths, signatures, and the uneasy silence of history shifting its weight. And so, on January 2nd, 1492, the gates of Granada were opened. The royal banners of Castile and Aragon rose above the Alhambra. The Christian army entered the city in solemn formation. Drums beat slowly, crosses were lifted high. From a distant ridge, Boabdil, robed in black, turned his horse one final time to gaze upon the city of his ancestors. His mother, the formidable Exile, is said to have whispered to him bitterly, "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." But Boabdil did weep. The place is still known today as El Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's Sigh. And with that breath, a civilization ended. The fall of Granada was not simply a military event. It was the quiet closing of a door that had stood open for 781 years. Al-Andalus, once a mosaic of cultures, ideas, and kingdoms, had flickered, faltered, and finally vanished into memory. In its place, the Catholic monarchy rose fully formed. 1492 would become a year of enormous consequence, not only for Granada, but for the entire world. That same year, the Alhambra decree would be signed, ordering the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. The promise of religious tolerance in Granada would be broken within a decade. Mosques mosques would be converted or destroyed. Arabic would be banned, forced conversions, and the Inquisition would follow. And later that same year, Christopher Columbus, financed by the very monarchs who now stood in the Alhambra, would set sail westward. The conquest of Granada was not the end. It was the beginning of empire. But in the silent courtyards of the Alhambra, time seemed to pause. The lions in the Fountain of Lions continued their eternal vigil. The poems on the palace walls whispered their verses, now unread by those who ruled them. The water still flowed. The stars still turned. The ghosts of Granada lingered. Some say they never left. And so ends the story of Al-Andalus, not in fire and fury, but in sighs, negotiations, and the heavy ache of loss. It was a civilization that burned brightly, a land of paradoxes, of scholars and soldiers, of minarets and monasteries, of betrayal and brilliance, a land where people once dreamed that art and war, prayer and poetry could share the same space, and perhaps, for a time, they did. But no dream lasts forever. As the banners of Castile and Aragon fluttered in the mountain wind, and the last sultan rode quietly into exile, Iberia was changed forever. The Reconquista was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The city of Granada had fallen. The banners of Castile and Aragon fluttered above the Alhambra's towers. But the surrender of a city is not the end of a people. For the Muslims of Granada, and indeed for all of Al-Andalus, 1492 did not mark the close of a chapter. It marked the beginning of a long and quiet struggle, not for land or sovereignty, but for identity. The capitulations of Granada, signed in the days before Boabdil's surrender, had been generous on parchment. They promised religious freedom. They pledged that Muslims could retain their mosques, their customs, their language. No one would be forced to convert. No one would be exiled. And for a time, it was so. Granada remained calm after its fall. The Catholic monarchs, keen to present themselves to Europe and the Church as noble and merciful victors, upheld their oaths, at least publicly. Muslims went on attending the mosque. The muezzin still sang the call to prayer. Children still studied Arabic, but beneath the surface, pressure was building. The Christian court in Granada was growing restless. Church authorities, particularly the Archbishop of Toledo, began pressing for conversion, seeing tolerance not as a virtue, but as a temporary political necessity. The clergy viewed Islam as a heresy, not a faith to be protected. Then came the appointment of Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, where his predecessor had been cautious and diplomatic. Cisneros was uncompromising and zealous. He believed that conversion must come swiftly, and if persuasion failed, coercion would suffice. By 1499, the fragile peace began to crack. Cisneros launched a campaign of forced baptisms in Granada. Qurans were confiscated and burned. Arabic books, thousands of them, were collected, and and set aflame in public squares. The rhythm of Islamic life, already fragile, was ruptured. The Muslim community, now seeing the betrayal of every promise, rebelled. A brief uprising in the Alpujarras Mountains broke out. It was swiftly crushed, but it gave Ferdinand and Isabella the pretext they needed. They declared that the Muslims had broken the terms of surrender. And with that, the legal protections of the capitulations were nullified. Now, conversion was no longer a choice, it was a requirement. By 1502, Islam was officially outlawed in the Crown of Castile. Muslims were given a single, terrible choice: convert or leave. But leaving was easier said than done. Where would they go? North Africa was distant, dangerous, and politically unstable. Most had no ties there. Their roots were deep in Iberian soil, their homes, their farms, their ancestors. Many chose to convert, at least outwardly. They became known as Moriscos, little Moors, publicly Christian, but often secretly retaining Islamic customs, prayers, and language. They lived in constant tension, under surveillance, suspected of insincerity. Their food was questioned, their dress scrutinized, their words eavesdropped upon, and soon the Inquisition came knocking. The Spanish Inquisition, originally aimed at uncovering false converted Jews, now turned its eyes toward Moriscos. Trials, torture, confiscation of property. It was a terror cloaked in righteousness. The very act of being different, of praying quietly in Arabic, of bathing too often, of cooking certain dishes, could be evidence of heresy. For many, the only survival was silence. And the fate of Iberia's Jews was no less tragic. In that same year, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews from Spain who refused to convert to Christianity. The Jewish community, which had coexisted with Muslims and Christians for centuries in many parts of Spain, was forced into impossible decisions. Many converted, becoming the conversos, or new Christians. But as with the Moriscos, suspicion clung to them like smoke. Others fled to the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, the Netherlands, Italy. Thousands died in exile, starvation, piracy, illness. Ships sank. Families were separated. Centuries of culture, scholarship, poetry, and tradition were scattered to the winds. The peninsula that had once birthed Maimonides, Ibn Rushd, and Zuryab, a land that once shimmered with diverse thought and philosophy, was now folding in upon itself, homogenizing, closing its gates to its own memory. The Spain that emerged from the ashes of Al-Andalus was not just Christian. It was uniformly Christian by force and design. The diversity that had once characterized Iberia was now cast as a threat. By the early 1500s, the Moriscos lived in a fragile half-existence. Muslim in private, Christian by decree. The mosques had been converted into churches. Arabic names were replaced with Spanish ones. The very language of Al-Andalus was disappearing. In 1567, a final blow came. King Philip II of Spain issued a royal decree. The use of Arabic was forbidden, as was traditional dress, music, and customs. Even silent remembrance became a crime. Another rebellion rose in the Alpujarras. It, too, was crushed. Then, in 1609, under Philip II, the ultimate decision was made. The Moriscos were to be expelled from Spain. Hundreds of thousands were forced to leave, the descendants of Muslims who had lived in Iberia for centuries. Whole villages were emptied. Ships crowded with families departed for shores that were not home, welcomed by few and distrusted by many, and thus the last visible traces of Al-Andalus faded, but not its ghost. Even today in Andalusia, there are echoes in the arches of churches that were once mosques, in the irrigation systems still used in farms, in words scattered through the Spanish language: almohada, pillow; azúcar, sugar; aceituna, olive; in the music, in the rhythm, in the DNA of the land. A culture can be crushed, but not completely erased. And as silence grew over the Iberian Peninsula, that silence still hummed with memory. The memory of gardens and calligraphy and golden domes, of coexistence and cruelty, of lost homes and whispered prayers, of a world that once was. In the years that followed the fall of Granada, the Iberian Peninsula was quiet, at least on the surface. The swords had been laid down. The flags of Castile and Aragon now flew undisturbed from mountaintop to sea, from the Pyrenees to the gates of Gibraltar. The land called España had taken shape. But peace is not silence, and victory is not without cost. The Reconquista, though often framed in simple terms, a triumph of Christianity over Islam, left behind a complex and lasting legacy, not just of ruins or stories, but of deep imprints etched into the very identity of Spain, into its language, its laws, its fears, and its dreams. Faith had been the banner under which the war was fought, the cross carried into battle, the Virgin invoked at sieges, the saints prayed to in the night before battle. But that same faith, once used as a beacon of resistance, was now turned inward, shaped into a tool of conformity and control. This was no longer just religion. It was nationhood. The Spain that emerged from the Reconquista was a new kind of state, one forged not by geography or bloodline alone, but by a singular religious identity. To be Spanish now meant to be Catholic. It was not merely a matter of belief. It was a mark, a measure, a passport, and a prison. Those who did not fit, whether Muslims, Jews, or even impure Christians, were forced to adapt or be cast out. The Spanish Inquisition, initially established in 1478 to investigate converted Jews, conversos, gained renewed strength after the Reconquista's conclusion. Now it had a broader mission: to enforce Catholic orthodoxy at all levels of society. And so Spain, newly united, turned its attention inward. It scrutinized bloodlines. It untested loyalties. The concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, took hold. Even generations after a family had converted, a taint of Jewish or Muslim ancestry could exclude one from office, university, or honor. It wasn't just belief that mattered, it was origin. And yet, paradoxically, Spain's very soul had been formed by those it now tried to forget. The Reconquista had lasted over 7 centuries, longer than most empires survive. In that time, Christians, Muslims, and Jews had lived together, fought, traded, intermarried, learned from one another. The architecture of Seville, Toledo, and Córdoba still bore Islamic curves and Hebrew inscriptions. Spanish law had inherited fragments of Arabic codes. Spanish poetry still echoed the rhythms of Andalusian verse. Even the language of Castilian Spanish, so proudly proclaimed, carried within it hundreds of Arabic words: almohada pillow, algebra, alcalde mayor, azul blue. These were not foreign borrowings. They were ingredients baked into the language, inseparable from it. So too with the music, the haunting strains of flamenco, with its sorrowful scales and sudden passion, drew deep from Moorish and Romany wells. The guitar, the clapping hands, the mournful voice, it all whispered of exile, of longing, of vanished worlds. Spain, after the Reconquista, tried to present itself as pure, singular, chosen. But it was, and always had been, a mosaic. Still, the trauma of the Reconquista was not merely cultural. It was emotional, psychological. Centuries of war had taught communities to distrust one another. It had carved the idea of the other deep into the Spanish psyche. To be Spanish was to belong to a certain faith, to speak a certain way, to eat a certain food, and anything outside that became suspect. This legacy would stretch far beyond Iberian shores. As Spain embarked on its age of empire, sailing west into the unknown, conquering lands in the Americas, it carried the imprint of the Reconquista with it, the same drive to convert, to purify, to dominate with faith as much as sword, would shape the colonization of the New World. When Spanish ships landed in the Caribbean, in Mexico, in Peru, they brought not only priests and soldiers, but the memory of Granada, of Toledo, of Córdoba. The cross and the crown had learned to work hand in hand on Iberian soil, and now they would do so again across oceans. The Reconquista had taught Spain that religion and rule were one. And what of memory? The victors, as always, wrote the official history. In chronicles, the Reconquista was framed as a holy struggle, a cleansing of the land, a divine mission fulfilled. Saints were credited, miracles recorded. The long Muslim presence was diminished, described not as a golden age, but as a foreign occupation, a deviation. But not all memories were burned. In quiet villages, in old songs, in architectural whispers, fragments of Al-Andalus survived. In the names of places, Guadalquivir, Albacete, Almeria, the past still breathed. Travelers and thinkers in later centuries, Washington Irving, Jorge Luis Borges, Federico Garcia Lorca, would feel the haunting pull of this forgotten world, and in the hearts of descendants of Muslims, Jews, and mixed families who scattered across the Mediterranean, the memory of Al-Andalus remained a garden lost, a paradise remembered. Whether mythologized or mourned, it lived on. Even in modern Spain, echoes of the Reconquista ripple. Nationalist movements have invoked it. Politicians reference it. Some romanticize the Christian victory, others lament the cultural loss. It remains a divisive and sacred story, a mirror held up to the Spanish identity. And yet, perhaps the truest legacy of the Reconquista is this: that nothing, no empire, no faith, no kingdom is forever. That memory is both a flame and a burden. That history once made cannot be unmade, but it can be understood. For the Reconquista was not just about battles and banners. It was about people, millions of them, trying to live, believe, and belong. Some succeeded. Many suffered. All left their mark. As you sit with this story, so long, so layered, perhaps you can feel the weight of time pressing gently against your thoughts, the dust of ancient roads, the hush of old cathedrals, the sigh of a vanished call to prayer on a breeze that no longer knows its name. These are not dead echoes. They are part of the soil, part of the sky, part of every stone and syllable of Spain. And when we remember them, we do not only look backward. We become, for a moment, timeless. When Granada fell in 1492, the ink had barely dried on the surrender papers before another chapter of Spanish history began. This one not across hills and valleys of Iberia, but across the open ocean. That same year, Christopher Columbus set sail westward under the Spanish crown. And though the goal was to reach the Indies, what he found instead was a vast, unknown continent, a world the Europeans would come to call the New World, but it would not be approached as something entirely new. It would be seen through the lens of something deeply familiar, shaped by 7 centuries of war, religion, and ideological resolve. For the men who arrived in the Americas, the conquistadors, missionaries, and governors, many had grown up in the final decades of the Reconquista. Some had fought in its last battles. Others had heard the stories by firelight of Christian knights reclaiming lands from infidels, of saints guiding swords, of kings crowned by divine will. They carried not just weapons and ambition, but a mindset, the same symbols that had adorned their flags in Granada, the cross of Santiago, the shield of Castile, were stitched into their cloaks as they marched through the jungles of Yucatan and the highlands of Peru. The cry of Santiago y Sierra España, once hurled at Moorish lines, was now echoed in strange lands against peoples who had never heard of Spain. The Reconquista had become a template, the spiritual justification used to reclaim Iberia from Muslims was now invoked to conquer the Americas. The native peoples, Aztecs, Mayas, Incas were cast in the same mold. As pagans, idolaters, enemies of God, just as Islamic mosques had been turned into churches, so too would Mayan temples be toppled to raise cathedrals in their place. And the mission was the same: conversion, control, and Christianization. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, declared early on that the purpose of colonization was not merely territorial, but spiritual. They saw themselves not only as rulers, but as defenders of the faith, continuing their sacred duty beyond the shores of Europe. To aid them, the papacy granted Spain the Patronato Real, or royal patronage, giving the Spanish crown immense control over church affairs in the colonies. Bishops, priests, and religious orders traveled with every fleet, every army. The Franciscans, the Jesuits, and others set about building missions, learning native languages, and teaching the catechism. But not always gently. Resistance was met with punishment. Entire communities were relocated, renamed, and reshaped. This spiritual conquest was intimately bound with military conquest. Where a cross rose, so too did a fort. Where gold was found, so too were baptisms demanded, and the conquistadors themselves, men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, embodied this dual legacy. Cortés, who overthrew the Aztec Empire, often framed his actions as not only imperial, but religious. He described Mexico as a land in need of cleansing, its people as captives of satanic gods, their idols as abominations to be destroyed. When Tenochtitlan fell, its great temples were razed, and crosses were erected in their place, just as had been done in Córdoba or Seville generations before. It was, in many ways, a continuation of the Reconquista, not just in action, but in belief. Spain had learned that conquest was more than victory, it was redemption, and now that redemption was applied with fervor across two vast continents. But the echoes of Al-Andalus went beyond ideology. They also shaped administration, law, and social structure in the colonies. In Iberia, the Reconquista had produced a complex relationship between Christians and non-Christians through conversion, coercion, and coexistence. Those patterns were repeated in the colonies. The Spanish crown instituted systems like the encomienda, in which indigenous people were entrusted to Spanish settlers for labor and conversion. While framed as a protective and spiritual relationship, in reality, it often resembled slavery, the justification. Much like with the Moriscos or Conversos, the natives were seen as people who could be saved, but only through submission. There was also a fascination with race and blood that followed the Spanish across the Atlantic, just as Limpieza de Sangre had determined who was truly Christian in Spain. So too did colonial society begin to obsess over ancestry. A caste system developed, dividing people based on their mixture of Spanish, indigenous, and African heritage. Every shade of skin had a label. every lineage a consequence. The shadow of the Inquisition, too, traveled to the New World. Tribunals were established in Mexico, Lima, and Cartagena, not only for heresy, but for witchcraft, secret Judaism, or native rituals deemed unacceptable by Christian doctrine. Public punishments, autos da fe, were held in the plazas, where heretics were sentenced before crowds, much like in Seville or Valencia. And yet, amid all this conquest and conversion, another echo emerged from the Reconquista: the tension between destruction and preservation. In Spain, even as Islamic rule was defeated, elements of Al-Andalus survived in architecture, art, agriculture. Likewise, in the Americas, despite centuries of colonial control, native traditions endured. Languages like Nahuatl and Quechua were not erased. Ancient festivals were woven into Christian calendars, and indigenous resistance, though suppressed, remained vibrant. Some Spanish thinkers, too, began to question the moral costs. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who witnessed the cruelty of colonization, argued passionately for the rights of indigenous peoples. He wrote, "The Spanish have destroyed so many kingdoms, slaughtered so many souls, all in the name of Christ." Perhaps it was the memory of Al-Andalus, the cultural richness, the betrayal, the forced conversions that stirred conscience in men like him. For history does not only instruct, it also haunts. By the 17th century, the Spanish Empire stretched across oceans, vast and golden. But the heart of that empire still beat with an old rhythm, the rhythm of the Reconquista. The Americas were not a clean slate. They were a canvas painted with old brushes, steeped in old ideas: faith, dominance, purity, glory. The tools refined in Iberia: spiritual conquest, racial hierarchy, religious absolutism, became the pillars of a colonial world. And as Spain grew rich from the silver mines of Potosi and the plantations of the Caribbean, it did so with the same duality it had always known: sacred and brutal, devout and ruthless, triumphant and tormented. In this way, the Reconquista did not end in Granada. It sailed west and planted itself in a new world. The clash of armies may have ended in 1492, but the soul of Al-Andalus did not vanish in the dust of Granada. Instead, it began to drift, becoming less a place and more a feeling, a memory just beyond reach, a vision carried in poetry, music, and soft twilight imaginings. For centuries after its fall, Al-Andalus was remembered with a strange kind of longing, not only by those who lost it, but by those who conquered it. It was both paradise and parable, a warning and a wish. The Reconquista had swept away an era. But even as Spain rose triumphant, it could not fully escape the beauty of what it had erased. Writers, travelers, and philosophers, Christian and Muslim, alike began to speak of Al-Andalus not as a threat, but as a golden age. In the Islamic world, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East, It became a symbol of lost glory, a time when Muslims, Jews, and Christians had lived side by side, when knowledge flourished, when cities like Córdoba and Granada were beacons of light in a darkened Europe. Among Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492, this memory was passed down like an heirloom. They spoke Ladino, a Spanish-infused language preserved in exile. They sang songs of Andalusia. They told stories of cities once shared, gardens once walked, and homes left behind forever. Even among the Spanish themselves, Al-Andalus became a subject of romantic fascination. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe turned toward Romanticism, the ruins of Moorish Spain drew poets and painters from across the continent. None more famous than Washington Irving, the American writer who lived in the Alhambra in the 1820s. There, by candlelight in its echoing halls, he penned his Tales of the Alhambra, a dreamy, haunting collection of stories that awakened the Western imagination to the splendors of Islamic Spain. He wrote of sultans and secret passages, of fountains that whispered, of ghostly sentries pacing moonlit towers. His words painted Granada not as a battlefield, but as a lost dream, a palace of memory suspended between history and legend. And it wasn't just literature. The architecture of Spain, those keyhole arches, tiled courtyards, and filigreed domes, was now appreciated as something exquisite, not alien. Moorish style, once seen as foreign, was embraced as part of Spain's unique identity. In cities like Seville, Córdoba, and Toledo, tourists wandered through mosques turned cathedrals, admiring the blend of East and West. The very stones seemed to speak of a shared past, one that could not be neatly divided into conqueror and conquered. Even in music, the old rhythms survived. The Andalusian cadence, with its bittersweet tension, found life in flamenco, a form born of Moorish, Jewish, and Romany influences. The wail of the singer, the cry of the guitar, the rhythm of the feet, all carried echoes of loss, defiance, and longing. It was not just nostalgia. It was a cultural inheritance. But this dream was never without complexity. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians began to challenge the myth of convivencia, the idea that Al-Andalus had been a utopia of interfaith harmony. While there had indeed been periods of coexistence, there were also moments of persecution, forced conversions, and rigid hierarchies. The truth, as always, was layered. Still, the idea of Al-Andalus endured, and perhaps it was the idea, more than the reality, that people clung to. In an age of rising intolerance and division, Al-Andalus became a metaphor, a time when cultures had brushed shoulders, when the call to prayer rose alongside the toll of church bells, when libraries were filled and streets echoed with many tongues. In recent decades, efforts have been made to revive and celebrate this shared heritage. Córdoba hosts music festivals that blend Arabic and Spanish traditions. Granada's Alhambra is preserved not as a monument of victory, but as a world treasure. Academics gather to study the science, medicine, and philosophy of medieval Muslim Spain. And in popular media, novels, films, even video games, Al-Andalus appears again and again, shimmering on the edge of memory. In the Arab world, it still evokes pride and pain, a paradise lost, a sign of what once was. In Spain, it remains a source of fascination and sometimes political debate. Some embrace it as a symbol of multiculturalism, others see it as a cautionary tale. Still others simply walk through the arches of the Alhambra and feel the weight of silence, of centuries stacked like stone. What is it about lost worlds that pulls us so? Why does a place that no longer exists stir such ache, such awe? Perhaps it's because Al-Andalus speaks not just to Spain, but to something universal. The human longing for a time when opposites touched, when difference did not mean division, when the sacred and the sensual lived side by side. In this dream of Al-Andalus, we glimpse the best and worst of ourselves, our capacity for beauty and for destruction, our hunger for power and for meaning, our need to belong and our fear of the other. As the moon rises over the Sierra Nevada and the fountains of the Alhambra murmur in the night, one can almost believe that time has folded in on itself. That somewhere, behind those carved walls, a scholar still reads by candlelight, a poet still sighs beside an open window, a people still hope. So ends the story of the Reconquista, not with a sword stroke, but with a breath. A long, quiet breath over centuries of struggle, and the fragile dream that endures after. Thank you for walking this path through time with me. Sleep well now. May your dreams be filled with towers and stars, with gardens that never fade, and the soft echoes of a past that still speaks. Good night.